Hello and welcome, humans and future sentient silicon beings, to the Fourth Age with Noah and Marty. Today we have special guest Eric Williams, who's an attorney, which is awesome because we haven't had an attorney on here yet, and he's the managing director of the Detroit Justice Center. Eric, could you introduce yourself? Tell us more.
Sure. I'm an attorney. I spend about 60% of my time working for a nonprofit law firm, helping communities address economic equity. And I spend the rest of my time working for my private clients, helping them with business issues, particularly related to contracts, intellectual property, that kind of thing.
That's
So that's
awesome.
what I
So
do.
Noah and I are both computer scientist nerds, and so it's really exciting to have somebody who's in the practical world because we like to explore in our own heads. I think a lot. One of the areas I
Well,
think.
I am, in fairness, fighting with the U.S. Patent Office about a
Okay,
patent
you
for
you
the
do real
last
stuff.
7 years.
Um, One of the areas I think we've run into is uh, IP and creators and who owns the IP. Stable Diffusion, Wally, and all these are producing images, or I'm sorry, Dolly are producing images out of the ether, but that ether is constructed of the creations of all of human society. And so, like to talk to you a little bit about who owns this stuff or where you see it going.
Right. So I have to admit, I work with a lot of people that make wonderful use of artificial intelligence. At the same time, I am not the biggest fan necessarily. In my mind, AI is like the master Lego builder that says, "Look at what I've built," but they don't want to acknowledge that all the Legos were stolen, right? I mean, that's kind of how they operate. And right now, I mean, you've got you mentioned some of the programs, like Midjourney and all this. The problem with this kind of intellectual property is that it wasn't made by a human, and that is really what for example, our U.S. Copyright Office has said. You can't get copyright protection for something that has been created by AI because the law requires that it be created by a human. And if it's not created by a human, then it's just not entitled to protection. Now, the question then becomes what constitutes creation, right? I mean, it says anything more than a de minimis amount of AI content is problematic. And whatever AI content there is has to be disclosed. But what's de minimis, right? Like how much is too much? And that's
Uh-huh.
kind of where we are right now. And we're
Has
waiting
that
for
been
the courts
tested?
to decide it.
Has it been tested much in the courts? I know there's been a couple of cases, but
Right. Well, none of them have reached resolution yet, right? So what we have
okay,
now are, the rulings of the Copyright Office saying how they're going to treat it, right? What their approach is going to be. But it hasn't come into the courts, which is sort of a separate system.
okay,
So yeah, we've had we've had registrations refused because there wasn't enough human content in it.
okay,
But
interesting.
yeah, it
So
hasn't been
people
tested. It
when
hasn't
they
really fallen in the
Well,
courts.
yeah.
when they
So
put that content up, do they specify how much?
uh,
Are people saying how much AI is in these submissions, or do they have to say?
You have to. In fact, the Copyright Office will cancel a registration if you don't disclose AI input.
Interesting.
so yeah, my favorite non-example is that so far nobody's gone after Disney or Pixar. I know that through the 2010s, basically the deep map that the Disney studios developed for their animation and the or deep canvas I think they called it, and of course Pixar and their various physics engines things released hour-long interviews attached to each one of their movies about how the film that they were producing would be unproducible without computer assistance, and whether or not we would now understand that to constitute an AI generation because they actually were creating sort of animatics and having the computer generate the individual cells through a generative process, and it would be fairly amusing if sort of the
Does
entire late Disney golden age were to be retroactively determined to be more or less the same thing as DALL-E.
Eric, how did they even when you have to specify how much AI you used? How did they specify AI, or did they just say how much AI did you use and leave it up to the courts to decide?
Right. So what's happened to date has been creators, and I'm putting that in air quotes, right, have attempted to get copyright protection for, in some instances, images, and in other instances, written works that were done primarily using artificial intelligence, right? So
Okay.
copyright provides you with pretty much exclusive right, with some exceptions like fair use, uh, exclusive rights to control how, the reproduction or use of a creative work placed in a tangible format. That's what copyright is. So people, the cases that have come up have involved, for example, images done with, Midjourney or other, images done created using AI, using verbal prompts, right? Written
Okay.
text
So
prompts.
very explicitly AI, as opposed to, like, to Noah's point, if I don't know, Toy Story 3 used an intelligent system for converting audio to mouth motion,
Right.
that
Right.
would be on
So,
the other side of it.
right. So they applied for copyright protection, and the Copyright Office said no. And well, initially they said, well, prove it, right? Prove that this was actually done, that this actually has some creative element to it. And so there was a lot. So they submitted issues listing what all the prompts were, and they really sort of went into what was done in order to get this output. And the Copyright Office said, nope, doesn't work. One has to be human, and I mean, so there's this huge discussion, and this will actually play out in court down the road. So what's the difference between this
Yeah.
and a photograph? What's the difference
Right.
between this and art made by throwing paint, right? You're not
I
in
was going to say
control of
that,
where
isn't there a
everything
piece of art
lands.
that's just a big square?
Right, exactly. So what is the human component? And they're losing. None of the AI registrations were actually allowed.
Interesting.
And
This is probably going to
yeah,
hit
it's
Supreme Court level, I would assume, and probably have to go
it
through a few series of, you know,
That might
societal
happen.
changes.
Although the Supreme Court did in NEPCO versus American Axle actually refuse to address a major intellectual property issue with vast implications after it became clear to them that that's what they were actually doing. So
Uh-huh.
the courts, there's a lot of finger pointing. My experience is more on the patent side of things, but there's been multiple briefs released by the U.S. Patent Office asking for court or legislative relief because the sort of covering patent law I think comes from the 70s, and then the major adjustments were in the 90s and then the 2000s, as the Supreme Court basically said you can patent software, and then they said, well, not all that software. We didn't mean quite that much, but they refused to
right.
specify what quite that much actually meant, and so there's been sort of a lot of finger pointing going on. The courts have said that it's Congress's problem. Congress put together a blue ribbon panel like 4 or 5 years ago and decided that if they changed
That's
anything that
ancient
they were
now.
all going to get killed. So they decided not to change anything, and the legislative branch has been asking for the court or the Congress to do literally anything to clarify what they're talking about. and so there's a lot of deadlocking over there. And I'd imagine that now that software has invaded the copyright space, it's going to get at least that bad and much more quickly.
So
Yeah,
you try to, when you look,
go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I'd like to ask a thought-provoking question, so it'll be to the next level. So maybe finish your thought, and we'll go to that.
Okay, so one of the things you have to remember is sort of copyright and patent both sort of serve different purposes, right? They both sort of are intended to advance the
The state of
value of arts
knowledge,
and
yeah,
science and
right.
right, exactly. That's what the purpose of them is, and so giving someone, a limited duration of protection. It's one thing when you're talking about patents because the way they work out is it's used primarily a method to allow people to have exclusive control and then therefore monetize it in a way that moves things forward. Copyright doesn't have sort of the same underlying intent as far as monetization goes, though with arts it does enable people to monetize, but it allows people to build on the knowledge of other people. And I think we've gotten to the point now where you can have software write software, right? I mean, at one point, I mean, it's sort of reproduction. And I don't know at what point we're going to say, hey, we give corporations, freedom, the right to free speech. At what point do we permit AI to copyright its own creations? It's a very sort of bizarre time we're living in, and it's going to require addressing it fundamentally. Will require really changing how we view creativity. Is it exclusively a human domain? And I don't think humans are ready to give that up yet.
Right. That's fascinating. You mentioned also photography, which I think is a fantastic example because I think the day that the camera, was somewhere around the 1860s, 1880s.
Yeah.
No,
I mean, there was a lot of work to do it.
Civil
But
War
today,
photographs, so we're talking
okay,
1850s,
1850s.
1840s
Okay.
even.
So, yeah. So today, of course, you just raise the camera and take a picture, and obviously we found art in that, but there's a lot of, simpleness to it. Are there any corollaries in the time that patents and copyright have existed of this kind of thing, like computers coming out and now, and Tron comes out and it was made on a computer? Was there any? Do you know of any history there? Was it hard to copyright any of that work because it wasn't made by, human hand or something?
Well, for Tron, rather unfairly, as it turns out, since virtually none of it was computer generated, the Academy did refuse to consider it for an effects
Yes.
Oscar.
It was computer generated, wasn't it? Not the clothes, but the interstitials of flying around and
There's, I
that's
think there's less than a minute total computer generated imagery
yeah.
on screen.
That sounds right.
There's a handful of sequences. The primary action sequences, including the humans, are all set based, and were all done in post production by hand.
So the Academy screwed them over. Was there? I'm wondering if there's any legal corollaries to what we're seeing today.
Well, I mean, you mentioned photographs, right? I mean, the Copyright Office was not thrilled
Really?
when the first attempt was made to copyright a photograph, right? I mean,
Oh, okay. I
and in
guess I
fact,
assumed copyrights came
yeah.
later in the
No,
U.S.
no. I mean, copyright's actually in the U.S. Constitution.
Oh, okay.
It's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
fundamental thing.
Now
It's
that
been here
you've
since.
Now that
that I've
you've
shown
moved
how
here,
clearly have not read it.
Marty, you should be aware that it was Jefferson's contribution to the U.S. Constitution
Okay.
to
I moved to
have.
Virginia 3 years ago. I need to learn
Yes,
more of my history.
yes, and specifically the
Okay.
Central Virginia area. Like I'm from Charlottesville. Thomas Jefferson is like the air we breathe
Yeah.
here.
Okay. So then, so when photographs came out, that alone was difficult to copyright, or there had to be some.
Oh yeah,
Okay. And was it
yeah. In fact,
legislation
the
that
first
allowed
ones
it?
were
Or?
like linotype kind of things that
Right.
you know.
Right.
It was those little tin things. That's where the first issue came out.
Okay.
And it was a person. It was the person who who like made a drawing, and then that was changed into that. And
Okay.
I used to know this. I learned it in law school, but I don't remember it right
Okay. Okay.
offhand. But
Do you know? Do you
yeah,
happen to remember if it
yeah.
was
So
legislated into copyright law, or if the courts worked it out?
well, so a lot of the things that get worked out with regard to copyright and similarly with regard to trademark are done by the Copyright Office. So
Okay.
it doesn't require legislation. It's more of a determination by the Copyright Office how they're going to handle a
Oh,
particular
okay.
issue when it comes in front of them. They have a lot of leeway. Welcome to the
So as the
administrative
winds
state, right?
change, they change their stance.
Maybe sometimes,
Okay. Sometimes. I mean,
sometimes
clearly with
not. They're
photography, I guess they have.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, they have, and I mean, but we're talking about photography, and we're talking about how this impacts, the people who are creating it, right? Whether or not they deserve, or
right.
the AI deserves to copyright it. But I mean, we just had, the Screenwriters Guild, SAG-AFTRA go on strike
Yeah.
because because of AI, at least in large part because of AI. So it's not just, you know companies or a few people using AI that are being impacted. It's our whole creative industry that's actually being
Yeah.
impacted by AI.
So the thought question I wanted to throw out there, we've talked about this a couple of times on this show, but the example I always pull up is Bill Watterson, who made Calvin and Hobbes, and I always have to read these names off the webpage because I can never remember. But he was influenced by Winsor McCay, George Harriman, Walt Kelly, and Charles Schultz. So four influences plus all of his existence, all that feeding into his comedy and all of that and his drawings. But he explicitly lists four plus, his existence. But I guess the question I have is, at what point does AI become just yet another brain in the same way that Bill Watterson has a brain, and it has all of its influences coming from all billions of images rather than say just four authors, and at that point it's just pure creation in the same way we do it, I guess.
So the distinction I would make is, and this is a really sort of higher level kind of discussion about it. It's how do you distinguish between a company and a human being, right? How do you distinguish between a corporation, which has a lot of the same rights as an individual, and a human being? And when I think about that distinction for legal purposes, and as I said, I do business contracts, so this is something that comes up a lot,
Yeah.
right? A corporation may do a lot of things, but a for-profit corporation only exists for one purpose, and that is to make profit. Okay? It doesn't have all these ancillary interests or adjacent interests or emotions or whatever. And in fact, if it veers away from the corporate purpose of making money, generally speaking, it can face a shareholder lawsuit. So it never seemed to me to make sense to give corporations freedom of speech because their speech will always be about the same thing, right? It's not, their speech isn't going to be about anything else. It's going to be, at least to some degree, related to money. Human beings have a whole range of things that are interests. So it makes sense for us to have freedom of speech, right? Corporations don't believe in God. No matter what you say, they don't have that belief. I don't know if we can make that same distinction with AI. I think we can make that same distinction with AI right now. I don't know if we'll be able to make that same distinction in 10 years. But for the moment, I think, AI exists for the purpose for which its creators created it. Even if they don't understand how it works, you got this whole black box thing going on,
Right.
which quite frankly scares the crap out of me. But it exists for that purpose. Until we get to the point where AI has interest aside from that given to it by its creators or operators, then I think the distinction between AI creations and human creations makes sense, and
So then the challenge is
we're
around,
different.
well then,
Well, let me
how do
let
I?
me retort
ahead.
to Marty's question and get your take on my take on that question. So, with AI, we actually do have the capacity to directly measure influences using these internal vector spaces that they operate on, which are way too big and way too complicated for us to understand, but they're essentially these incredibly high dimensional figures. And that is somewhat related to the token size. I think ChatGPT has announced that their current token size is going to be 128,000 tokens, which is basically any one of these shelves behind me is about that, I think. So, with that in mind, it actually becomes possible for AI systems to create a closeness measure and a direct measurement of pre-influences from their systems, both for the things that they generate and also for the generations of other works. So it becomes hypothetically possible to, say, plug Stephen King and previous horror writers like Poe or H.P. Lovecraft or something like that into the system and sort of determine from pretty simple vector multiplication sort of how much Stephen King there is in Stephen King and how much building on the canon of written literature exists within Stephen King. So from that perspective, the actual measurement values could come into existence from an AI perspective. And again, getting back to an earlier thing you were saying about how human beings would be unlikely to be willing to relinquish creativity, this would probably largely expose the degree of uncreativity that truly exists, that it looks good to us because we're sort of inside this objective bubble, but AI could expose us as sort of copy pasting machines that are just conning ourselves. So where do you think that sort of thing could come in, if some sort of merry prankster argument starts coming up? The same kind of thing that led to open source types of movements in the first place, using copyright law to enforce freedom, using AI to reveal implicit plagiarism, if you will.
Okay, so I'm going to take issue with that, right? So I disagree with the premise here. Okay,
Okay.
so so the number of written works is finite, right? I mean, and the number of horror stories ever written is finite. And human experience and emotion may ultimately be finite, but I think that number is a hell of a lot bigger than the number of horror stories. So the
Oh,
number of
absolutely,
ways you
yes.
can be scared is infinitely is a whole lot bigger than the number of horror stories ever written. And just a change in one word can switch how a story resonates with a reader, right? I don't think AI is capable, at this point anyway, of deducing what word will resonate, for example, with a black reader or a white reader or a reader who's been through a war or a reader who was abused as a child. Or I don't think AI is capable of that. And because I don't think it's capable of that, I think if you were to reduce what we have, if you were to reduce all the works of every, sort of romantic kind of novel, from Zane, or written work from Zane to Lord Byron, down to its essence, right? I think that wouldn't be doing, even if you found a commonality there, you wouldn't be doing justice to human creativity and emotion. I don't think AI is even close to that just yet, right?
I
Heck,
I quite agree with
I'm not
you.
religious, but if you've ever been in a
Okay.
church and heard somebody sing, come on now.
Yeah.
I
Sometimes somebody
quite
can
agree
hit
with
that
you
note
that
and you get chills.
yes, that the AI that we have, the generative, in particular the generative AI that we have, is nowhere near those sorts of capacities. However, uh, never get in a big number contest with a computational math geek. The
Same here.
the mere
Okay, I'm sorry.
existence. Yes, I had to brush off a phone company on this recently. So um, the the existence of relatively small sample sizes to date is something that we might see getting shifted around very, very rapidly. And we are seeing happen very, very rapidly. History's happening faster than it's ever happened before because of how much data that we're recording all over the place. And so
Can I throw a
these
curveball at you real quick?
okay.
What about creatives who don't want their creative output to be sampled or used or be part of a data training set, right? So, do they have a right to do that? And what happens when you have enough of that the data set, that training data, which already has sorts of issues with bias, right? Suddenly is missing a huge part from people who just didn't want their stuff to be part of it.
I think Sarah
I'm
Silverman did this recently. I think she sued, or I don't know, if she might have been part of a lawsuit to try to get her book taken out of the Open AI
Yeah.
or other
I
portals.
think I think Prince is a much better example because he was so adamant that that not happen that he effectively produced most of his life's work in private. After he got to sort of the Prince level of Prince, he stopped releasing. He kept recording and creating new work and producing it and stuff like that. But the vault that was left behind after his death is still being litigated to this day. And I think there's a very rational reason to not want to participate in the society that is presenting itself to us. And I think we're losing huge amounts of creative and productive effort because of that. And I think that this iteration of AI will exacerbate that issue to a degree that might not be supportable by civilization generally. And that's something that I think we should be directly addressing in those terms. I think it's entirely reasonable not to want your things to influence certain aspects of society, particularly basically these soulless machines that are doing a lot of linear algebra to create your own voice out of a black box,
When you say
creating the ability.
soulless machines, when you say soulless machines doing linear algebra, are you referring to us? Because I think you deduced
Uh,
our entire brain to a.
well, I would. I don't. Again, I don't think that our biological brains. I think that biology is has more layers of computational sophistication than are captured within the neurons, and we're not talking about neural paths that are as big as our brains in the first place. So I don't think that it's us. I think that these AI machines could easily be characterized that way, and I think that corporations might also be fairly characterized in that fashion. And the
I
ability
agree.
now to Stephen Hawking got a copyright on that vocoder thing so that people couldn't. People were doing this. There were companies that would sell you Stephen Hawking answering machines because it was just this buzzing tone, and he got a copyright so that when he spoke, it was his voice.
Oh
And
wow.
we assume that, but that's over. Like I've seen multiple people give presentations that of avatars that they created. There's no reason why they would have to create that avatar. In the 2000s, there was a whole big burst that fortunately didn't go very far of bio identity, and the idea that everybody will be able to use their voice and their fingerprint for 100% of their online things. And there's still some of that in there, but what happens when you can duplicate that using AI? And I think it's entirely reasonable not to want OpenAI or some other group of people that pile up a few $1 million worth of silicon to be able to be you as a person for any legal or other purpose.
Is it a fair corollary what happened in Back to the Future, where not in the movie but in the making of it, where in part 2 they didn't want Crispin Glover back? Is that his name? But they instead got an actor, and they got a face mask of him to look like him, and so they had an actor pretend to be him. I believe I can't remember what the outcome of it was, but I believe there was legislation passed that said that that's not allowed.
There was
but
a
to me, that's
really
fairly similar.
major lawsuit, yes, on that one.
Right.
Are you
So
familiar with this case, Eric?
I've lost a lot. What movie were you talking about? I lost
I'm sorry.
a
So
lot.
in Back to the
Yeah,
Future
yeah.
2, the original producers, yeah, you went mechanical there, Marty, for me at any rate.
Oh,
In Back to
good.
the Future 2, the producers had not apparently had a particularly good relationship with Crispin Glover, and so for the reshoots and other pieces of those scenes, rather than hiring him back, they got a different actor to put on a face mask and shot around some of the things that they wanted to do to create the illusion that Crispin Glover was there. Using modern technology and some of these things that the Screen Actors Guild was complaining about, they would have been able to do body scans of Crispin Glover, and simply they could just stick him in an extra in, Jurassic Park 18 if they felt like it. Like, they
Or
just, oh,
or can you? Yeah, can you just go find a? I think there was some study showing how many numbers of doppelgangers there are for all of us out there. So can you go find a Matt Damon doppelganger, and what is that? Are you allowed to do that?
I've mentioned this before that, like, what if you're not imitating Drake? What if you're imitating this guy that you found in southern France that happens to look exactly like Drake, and this other person you found in Western Canada who happens to sound exactly like Drake, and you simply created an avatar with those two people's full permission, and who cares that it just happens to look and sound for all human perception to be this other person.
So, well, Drake would care.
Yes,
That's who would care
yes.
first and foremost, and and you would have a problem because he would sue you. Whether or not, I mean, you could. It's similar to saying, well, my name is McDonald, so I can open a hamburger place with me. No, you
Yeah,
can't do
doesn't
that.
work.
And,
Right.
yeah, and if you and the actual so as you mentioned, SAG-AFTRA and the Screenwriters Guild all went on strike over the use of artificial intelligence, and the agreements that were ultimately approved. Well, they have some loopholes that I think are going to be problematic down the road, but for the most part, at least for now, they've prevented some of that, right? So you can't replace a writer with AI, right? You can't do that. You're not allowed to if you're going to be using AI on a writer's work, if it's other than just sort of like correct, tightening it up or grammar, you have to get their permission first. I mean, there are all sorts of things. Duplicate. You can't duplicate an existing actor, their facial features, or something that's very similar, and then use that without their permission. And if you do it, for example, if you're talking about an extra, you would have to pay them for the hours that they would have worked to actually film the thing that you didn't film, right? There's some exceptions. If you make over $80,000 per film, this rule doesn't apply to you. But the thought being, if you make more than that, you can probably negotiate this part on your own. So there are some limitations on how AI can replace creators right now, and that's not legislation. That's the power of, you know, capitalism and a 3 month strike
Yeah,
costing,
the power
major
of unions.
corporations hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah, that's basically what it is. And I think to the extent we see protections for creatives, it's gonna be through that kind of
Yeah.
mechanism. It's going to be strikes, labor stoppages, and the like.
I
Yeah,
can't help but
that's
wonder if in 10 years all of this is going to seem um, silly. And the reason I'm thinking about like Tron, where of course you can't use computers for creating graphics. That doesn't count. That's not a human or photography. And I just wonder if in how many years people are going to say, no, that's silly. AI is a part of everyday life. It just feels so. Something about it feels very primitive in the thinking. But of course, we're on the cusp of kind of a revolution here.
I'd be more willing to think that in 10 years some of these down the road loopholes we will suffer them at increasingly rapid speeds,
Yeah,
and figure out more and more ways that we're not happy that we in fact can be imitated. Because if, for example, Drake does pull together some kind of trademark agreement that in fact Drake is Drake and he gets to be who he is, and creates the precedent that that's foundational to human identity, or the only legal way that it gets represented, that's bad for the rest of us because I don't want to have to trademark being me. I just want to, wake up in the morning and get it for free. And
yeah.
and
This bumps into one of the things I've wondered about is, Eric, you're familiar with the Turing test? Is that generally okay? So one of the areas I'm interested in is I call it, I guess, specialized Turing test, and that would be if there was Noah right here and there was Noah the AI on the right side. It's not about differentiating. Can I tell the difference between a human and a computer? It's can I tell the difference between Noah and fake Noah? And one thing I think might happen here is we're going to really have to come to grips with what even is identity. One of the things we differentiate here is, and I think you've alluded to a little bit, is it's not clear if the AI can achieve human creativity and do amazing things that we do. But I'm pretty certain if we're not already there, that the AI can make something that we think uh, uh, is amazing. And we always refer to the Furby, this little device that was really simple toy from 1997, but it got banned from the NSA and the Pentagon because they thought it was thinking. And so my thought here is that humans are very easy to fool, and I think it's not going to be very long before we start being very, very fooled.
It's, the more our interactions are limited to this kind of thing, right? The greater that possibility becomes. If we had to rely on things like, look at it this way, you could fall in love with an AI online, right? I
Yes,
mean,
there's
just
AI
interacting.
girlfriends now.
Right, exactly.
I don't know how
You
good they
can
are.
do that.
Yeah.
Well, in many respects, they're completely useless, right? We haven't gotten to the point where AI has pheromones. You're not going to.
Oh,
You're.
yeah.
It's as long as life is lived outside of what we're doing right now, then AI is limited. There are people who live their lives and AI has absolutely no impact on them whatsoever, right? I mean, they pay for things in cash. They, they don't have access to the internet. They don't work. I mean, they work on sustenance. It's like they're eating what they farm. To them, it doesn't matter, and you could not possibly fool them into thinking that AI was human because they don't interact in AI's realm, right?
Uh-huh.
So that will always be our saving grace, or at least for the foreseeable future, our
Yeah.
saving grace.
Yeah. Only problem we're seeing now is AI used for fraud. So even if they don't interact with AI, the AI will interact with them.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a good
so
point.
yeah, I would say that yeah, in the event of us collapsing this civilization, there are people living lifestyles that are sustainable, not on this continent, well, in the extreme far north, I think, but that does exist. But I would caution. I have a more expansive view of AI than just the generative AI, and the AIs that we've been plugging into our markets for the last quarters to a third of a century are disrupting your day-to-day life. And for people who aren't solely living a subsistence life off the land in places nobody else cares about lifestyle, the the changes to the economy that are being wrought by most of the opinions in our marketplaces being generated by machines that are working for these for-profit companies that have no interests beyond absorbing more cash from the system, are affecting the lives of those kinds of people and severely limiting their economic and consequently cultural and social scope. And that's a bad thing in my books.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. Yeah, no argument here.
Speaking of things bumping into our lives, Eric, you mentioned your passion for surveillance, and I thought, I'd like to get on that topic before we run out of time. Clearly, AI is going to make whatever problems we had with surveillance only thousands of times worse. And I wanted to just start with, what your interest is in it, how you bumped into it.
So Detroit instituted a number of years ago, about 5, 6 years ago, a program called Project Greenlight. And Project Greenlight involves, theoretically, cameras that are monitored in real time. They are by the Detroit Police Department. But unlike a lot of other cameras, they are placed on private property, right? So which sort of changes the whole dynamic with regard to your your constitutional protections, right? You go onto someone's private property, you can be filmed, kind of thing. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy. The issue came about 2, maybe 3 years after the program had been up and running. We discovered that DPD, there was the software that ran it actually was enabled with facial recognition, and nobody knew this. And so suddenly there were a lot of questions, right? There have been three sort of well-publicized instances of people being arrested after a faulty facial recognition identification. They've all happened in Detroit, and they've all happened to black people. So that kind of, this is something I've always really been concerned with, particularly since Detroit is a hub for activism, whether we're talking for, ethnic or religious minorities, the labor movement, all that. And the one thing we know for sure in this country is that if you allow the government to surveil you, if you give them technology, they will misuse it. And you can look at everything from the Ghetto Informant Program to COINTELPRO, surveillance of Muslims in the aftermath of 9/11, goes on and on and on. If you build it, they will misuse it.
They will abuse it.
So once you include AI capabilities in this, it becomes really, really kind of frightening what can be done and how little control we have over it, particularly when you look at the fact that racial bias, and I'm a black dude, so this matters to me, right? I mean, racial bias is real. Take surveillance like NYC's Stop and Frisk program, right? So I always hated the name Stop and Frisk because I lived in Brooklyn as this was happening, going to law school at Columbia. And Stop and Frisk worked like this. I'm walking down East Flatbush. Somebody not in a police uniform walks up behind me, grabs me by my collar, throws me against the wall, puts a gun to my head and says, "Empty your pockets." I don't like that, but that was how Stop and Frisk operated in East Flatbush. So, but despite the fact that you had like 4.4 million people stopped, 80% of them were black or Latino. New York's only about 50% black and Latino. White people were twice as likely to have guns on them and 3 times as likely to be carrying other contraband than the black people they stopped.
Yeah.
That it was just completely racial profiling. But then
Yeah.
you build a system of predictive, policing that's based on arrest and stop records that are so skewed, right, that you automatically end up with bad outcomes when you start using it for things like sentencing, or probation, or any of those other things, because this bad data is baked into the system, and we're
Right.
seeing that time and time and time and time again in everything from looking at how, like arrest, looking at using it for policing, using it for credit card, getting your credit
Yep.
cards, your insurance rates, getting mortgages.
I
And this is kind of
yeah.
frightening because you're creating a really kind of racist creature in
Yes,
this AI.
and you're taking any areas that are already struggling and you're just making them way worse. I remember somebody coming and talking
Exactly.
about some program that was well-meaning, but the idea was, hey, I'm going to visit New York City. I've never been there. What are the areas I should not go to that are? I've got my kids. I don't want to go to a dangerous area. And all it did was to act as like a positive feedback loop for bad things.
Right, exactly.
Well, yeah, one issue that raises from my point of view is that reasonable doubt isn't actually where it needs to be in our culture today. The the basic human intuitions based on sort of human decision making and the concept that you're a member of a community that you're familiar with and aware of and can trust appropriately goes out the window if in fact tips are being generated by machines that are black boxes that were trained on histories that are of unknowable provenance. And so at that point the there's a direct point where the government isn't meeting its standards to be able to take action under the sort of constitutional principles of reasonable doubt. But there's also a meta problem that by exploiting these issues, the government is in fact delegitimizing itself from even existing because they're abrogating their foundational duties to secure our rights. Again, I don't want to have to copyright and trademark my entire existence to be able to be a person. That's their job is to make sure that I get all that stuff, with my taxes, or even without my taxes if it's a kid or something. So that these things raise the bar of how hard it is to actually operate as a government. And there are technologies. I think ShotSpotter has a much better sort of history where in the San Francisco area they have some public microphones that can triangulate the locations of where a gunshot is taken, which is a reactive.
Ooh, I take real exception to that. I'm currently suing the city of Detroit over ShotSpotter.
Okay, okay, yes,
Interesting.
good. I'd be interested because that at least is a little more on the reactive. It's after it happens rather than before it happens, but it's
True.
still being carried out as the result not of a human action, but as a machine action that is not built into the society that accepted it. So where are your issues?
But so here's the problem with that, though. Well, so here's the problem with that, right? So for example, Chicago is actually getting rid of it. They were like, it doesn't work. It's not worth it. It costs money. But one of the things it does worst of all, and there's a whole bunch of them, but it picks up a lot of signals that actually aren't gunshots. And in a large urban environment, that's kind of inevitable that you will hear sounds
Like a
that even the
car
most
backfire or something.
sophisticated microphone, a garbage bin
Garbage
lid
dropping.
slamming. I mean,
Right.
firecrackers, those kind of things. But what you get is once you do that, you are dispatching police officers into a community with the thought that there is a weapon and
Uh,
somebody using it
yeah.
there.
They're
You
ready for
get
it.
police
Yeah.
officers arriving in a very different mindset than they would otherwise. And that's dangerous, particularly when you can, for minority communities where cops are already rolling up with
Yep.
kind of an attitude.
Ready.
Now, I say this, my father's a retired Detroit police officer. My son is currently a police officer in New Jersey. So I don't have an inherent, my mom is actually a retired state trooper. I don't have anything against
Wow.
against law enforcement, but you're creating a situation where something very bad, think of Tamir Rice, right? He's a young kid, 12 years old, playing with a toy gun in a park.
Yeah.
Police car rolls up and he gets shot within 2 seconds of the police officer getting out of the car, and he wasn't pointing it at anyone. And the 911 operator said, "I think it's a toy."
Wow.
So yeah,
So,
that
yeah,
that
the
does
shot spot is
that does get
problematic.
to that cause effect side of things. Having it as a piece of a post investigational where you have an existing report and then you can localize that report using ShotSpotter sounds reasonable. Using it as a investigatory starting up tool gets you right back into that.
Same problem.
Let's let the machine do our thinking for us, and then the machine isn't and cannot be sophisticated enough to actually meet the needs of a culture and a society, and so it screws everything up.
Is there
Can I
a
ask you guys a
world?
question? You're the computer
Go for it.
guys.
Yeah.
I'm real curious about this. I think everybody agrees that we have some issues with bias making its way into the training. Can that be fixed? I mean, do we have to completely like kill the AI and give birth to a new one, training it differently in order to get that out of there, or is that just sort of baked in and it's always going to be there as a particular sort of algorithm evolves?
You know, well, it all goes back to your data set, and I'll tell you one challenge with ChatGPT that I've already seen is that it's already biased because the data set is, American. So if you ask it to make a chicken recipe for dinner tonight, you say I have chicken. It's going to be an American recipe. It's not going to be Indian or Chinese. It's already kind of biased in certain directions like that. It would be really hard, I think, to build a sophisticated AI without having very difficult to surmise biases. I think we've already started to learn a little bit about ChatGPT's bias. Noah, wasn't there a report saying it's libertarian and left leaning? The challenge.
So that there's actually been some people doing studies on its political affiliations, and in fact, they have shifted libertarian and left since ChatGPT, I think 3.
Yes.
4 is slightly more left libertarian than 3 was, and there can be, and I'm sure will be, other studies to determine other sorts of biases that exist, and you'll be able to find infinite numbers of them. So
But yeah,
my take on that question is that 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 effectively gets at the heart of where the problem that AI presents us, because while the generative AIs are not currently generally superior to human beings, some of these narrow, super intelligent AIs are generally superior to human beings. There was a paper, I just sent you a link to it last week, Marty. The Google announced the discovery of something like 220,000 new crystal forms, ways that you can pack atoms together
yes.
that will turn out to be stable. And in their paper, they provide a little context. In the first sort of 5,000 years of human history, we discovered about 10,000 crystal forms. And then over the last 50-ish years or so, in the computational chemistry era, we discovered another like 20 or 30,000 crystal forms. And then in a week, they discovered like 250,000 more. So the way they present that is that they did like 2 million years of chemistry in a week. But they are building on something we're building on. that's an enormous potential realm of new things that we will be able to experience by sort of discovering that they're real and that they exist, and perhaps figuring out how to make them and build things out of them. And that's tremendous, but that places stresses on our society that will require us to reform our society in entirely new ways. And I use a lot of sort of mechanical analogies. So roads in the Middle Ages, some of them sucked, some of them were okay, but none of them would be able to stand up to modern rail travel or modern 18 wheelers. They would get ripped up instantaneously. In the same way, the kinds of social interactions that we use, we cannot expect them to be able to stand up to these sorts of noise pressures and biases and so on. And so I would expect the solution is probably not so much that we would have to categorically eliminate surveillance or other tools from law enforcement, although certainly would have to take them away from the law enforcement we have, because they're not up to the task of coping with them. The problem is working out how to actually acquire functioning legal enforcement in a world where deep fake is possible, where everything's being surveilled at all times, sort of whether you want it to be or not, and so on. And so the I'd say the problem actually exists at constitutional or even pre-constitutional levels, where significantly stronger protections need to be built into the system, and reform has to happen at those levels and in those terms in order to be able to keep these things from just shaking everything to pieces.
There's also, and I think I want to say that this is the mutual assured destruction approach. You can, there's been a couple of interesting examples of using the AI to police the AI. I mean, I don't know how many times we're going to reference Tron in this one episode, but if you were to build, I've seen some systems, the idea would be to look for bias or to look for behaviors by just looking for where the statistics are not even. And I don't, that seems like it's another can of worms. It's just going to make things more dangerous. But I wonder, if we're going straight toward a world where you're going to have AI surveilling everything, which it seems like we keep edging that direction.
Once again, that is the
only
past. We've been living in that
Yes.
world for a few
Okay.
years. We
Well,
need to figure out.
now even more. So yeah,
Right.
whatever we had in the past, now even more. And so, is there a world now where we need AI to police the AI? And Eric, you asked about how we think about this problem as computer scientists. A lot of it's feedback loops, and the way you get to a stable universe a lot of times is with a feedback loop that tries to reduce some error bar. The question
Actually,
is, do you choose the right
that's
error bar?
that's what I'm fighting with the U.S. Patent Office about. So
Yep.
I've developed a AI stable, super intelligent marketplace to replace existing commodity markets, and they have been told by somebody that they are not allowed to extend a patent on this subject, in spite of the fact that it's completely new and is obviously better than what currently exists. And they're not allowed to talk about who that somebody is. So we'll find out at some point, maybe.
Okay. So, I think one of the things we can all agree on is that the current protections that exist, right, the current guardrails on our system, whether you're talking about our economy or our political system, or whether you're talking about a particular, a more narrow field, they're inadequate. They were not created to deal with artificial intelligence, generally speaking.
No.
In the world of surveillance, I have really advocated for putting a pause on AI augmented surveillance until we create those guardrails. Because in the absence of them, there is a vulnerability there that should make everyone feel nervous. And it would be bad enough if all we had to worry about was simply human error or the police misusing it. But AI hallucinates. I mean, so
Yeah.
I mean, there are things to worry about we can't even comprehend yet. And so to me, it has always just seemed a no-brainer that until we get a handle on this, we really limit where we give free reign to AI. And this really goes against the human instinct. How many times have you been driving somewhere and had, MapQuest or Google Maps tell you take a left here and you're like, "No, I know that's wrong." Most people will turn left anyway rather than pull over and double check themselves, or not even pull over, just go, "No, that's wrong," and keep driving. We have gotten to the point where we rely on technology to a degree that we don't rely on our own common sense. And that's, it's one thing if you punch something into a calculator and it comes up and you go, "That number doesn't seem right." You double check your math. But your calculator isn't, in most cases, isn't going to go on a racist rant or send you plummeting over a bridge, right?
right.
So we're talking about very different worst case scenarios as far as technology goes.
Much bigger
And until
consequences.
we get a handle on that, we should probably chill on it,
Yeah.
you know?
And I think what's scary to me is I don't think we have any clue what the consequences are yet. They're far probably more
No,
complicated.
not,
than we
not really.
Yeah, yeah. This is awesome. I'm so glad we got to talk to you about this stuff. I was wanted to know if you could tell the viewers, listeners, where to find, where to get in contact with you if they want to talk to you more.
Sure. You can reach out. My website is eWilliams PLLC, just like it sounds. EPLLC at the end, at the beginning and the end, with Williams, the conventional spelling, in the middle.com. And you can find, how to reach me there. eWilliams PLLC. And I'm just kind of everywhere. LinkedIn, Google me, baby. That's all you gotta do.
Yeah,
So,
awesome.
all right.
And for us, if you want to find us in more places, we're now on YouTube and Spotify, and hopefully someday Apple Podcasts will list us. Thank you, Eric.
Hey, it's been a pleasure.